All right. Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, joining us this week to give us a briefing on the top events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Adnav, and good evening from Israel. A little bit, something that we probably haven't done in quite a while is really lead and spend the majority of my opening remarks on political issues, purely political issues, but that's where we are today. I'll start with something which is a little bit bellicose, but I think when I explain, it will become apparent why these comments were made, and they're made by Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of the Israel-Lebanon party, a right-wing party sitting in the opposition currently, who's been attacking Netanyahu from the right on security issues and from the left on social issues. And basically, he said today that we are now starting to see the countdown to elections and the end of this government. Now, obviously, someone like Avigdor Lieberman would wish that happened yesterday, and certainly, if not, then at least tomorrow. They're still not coming so quickly, but I do believe that these comments are an indication that we are entering a period where elections are almost inevitable. And again, I want to stress, and I'll explain why, that doesn't mean we're having elections today, tomorrow, next week, the month after. In fact, we will not be. But certainly, it's now clear that elections are inevitable. They may be in 2025, and I would personally put my money on them being in the early part of 2025. But it will have major political ramifications for a lot of what's done by the political level in the coming months. So the question is, how do we get to today? First of all, it began with the quitting of the government, the war cabinet of Benny Gantz and his party, which led to the demand by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the internal security minister, the head of Otzma Yehudit, the most right-wing party in the government, to take Gantz's place at the table of the war cabinet, because it's clear over the 8 months or so that that's where the major decisions have been made, and many on Netanyahu's right claimed that they want a seat at the table and the war has not been run. They blamed Gantz for many months, but if you actually look at the 91 decisions that were made of the war cabinet when Gantz was in, Gantz and Netanyahu voted together on every single occasion. So while there are some who like to claim, well, Bibi was held hostage by Gantz, Bibi basically and Gantz voted on every single issue. Yes, there were disagreements, and there certainly remain, but when it came to actual decisions, they decided together and voted together. That's, I think, one of the most important part of this. So then basically, so how did Netanyahu get over the idea that Ben-Gvir, and by the way, Smotrich probably as well, would want to join the war cabinet? Well, he simply disbanded the war cabinet, making a fuss about needing a war cabinet to make decisions. Instead of allowing someone else to join it, he basically disbanded the war cabinet completely. And any relevant issues are now going to be brought up before a consultation committee, which obviously is not the same and obviously can be bypassed, and a lot of decisions will now be made by the Prime Minister largely alone, with certain decisions having to go to the wider security cabinet. But what really led to Lieberman's prediction today, specifically today, was the removal of what was called the Rabbi's Law from the docket of the Knesset. Now, I'll have to explain what that means. The Rabbi's Law, I'm sure it's got a longer term, but that's what it's been called, or as critics will call, like Lieberman, the law for for jobs for Shas Law is basically to take control of greater control of community rabbis. In Israel, cities, towns have rabbis. Some of them have two, one Ashkenazi, one Sephardi. If they're big cities, then they'll have neighborhood rabbis. This costs the taxpayers a lot of money. The law would expand the powers of the local rabbis, create many, many more local rabbis, adding tens of millions of dollars to the budget, and basically give Shas more control, the Sephardi Orthodox party, over communities up and down the country, and basically give jobs that are worth a lot of money, up to 50,000 shekels a month for rabbis. The reason that this suddenly came back onto the Knesset docket was because while Gantz was in the government, there was an agreement as part of the unity government agreement that no non-war related issues or laws will be brought up. And as soon as he left, the Shas party decided, well, now's the time to pass this law, which is very important to them. And basically what happened is that they found that as the law needed to go through a committee in the Knesset, there was no majority. And why there was no majority were two reasons. First of all, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was extremely upset about being shunned from the war cabinet and having a seat at the table, decided he was no longer going to have to adhere to the coalition whip. Second of all, there is a growing group within the Likud. They're called the liberal group. And again, liberal meaning not necessarily the liberal in terms of American liberals, but more the old school liberals, who are basically feel that this is not a law that's important. This is a law that wastes money. This is not a law that we should be doing during wartime. And this is simply not a law that really makes common sense. So we saw at least 4 members of Knesset and at least 1 minister come out against this. And this basically forced, and certainly, if not the first time, but certainly in a long time, a major retreat by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who then ordered the coalition whip to remove it from the docket. Now, this obviously upset the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition. And as I've mentioned many, many times, each of the parties in the coalition, each of the 5 parties, obviously I include the Likud in that, can bring the government down on their own. And each of the ultra-Orthodox can do so. This was more of a Shas rather than the United Torah Judaism bill, but obviously it inflamed them. They felt that they should get what comes to them as well. They're part of the coalition, so they should also. And they put out quite a long condemnation of the behavior of certain coalition partners. But most importantly, they did not threaten any sanctions. And they certainly did not threaten to leave the government. And it's clear that they won't leave the government. Netanyahu will see if he can find some way to bring it back at some point. But the fact is, this was a major about face, which was a major defeat from Netanyahu. And most surprisingly at this point is that there were Likud rebels. And not 1, not 2, but at least 4, 5, 6, maybe even more quieter ones, who basically decided that they were going to stand up to Netanyahu, and they won. And this is really relatively unprecedented, especially at this time of war, and it certainly does not bode well for Likud. And basically, there are all the other parties in the government are now saying, well, if they're not going to pass our law, then we're not going to necessarily stand by. So you can imagine coalition indiscipline could lead to a lot of fights in the days ahead. What was also interesting is that what's coming up, this rabbi's law was relatively inconsequential, but what it did speak to is a larger battle on the horizon, and that's the enlistment law. As we've said in previous weeks, the enlistment law, there was a lot of, it's quite a complicated issue, but basically since the beginning of the state, ultra-Orthodox Jews do not have to serve in the army. This was never officially legalized, and the Supreme Court was asked to rule on this, and they said that the government has to make some sort of legal standing. They were not able to do so because of all the different sides. Obviously, in the last government, the Gantz, Bennett, Lapid government, they did actually get through a first reading of a law which had minimal standards, which meant only a couple of thousand ultra-Orthodox would have to go every year, getting up to maybe 10,000. I mean, there's tens of thousands every year who seek the deferment, so it's really it's just like a drop in the ocean. But basically what Netanyahu did cleverly is he decided, okay, I'll take that law because it is so minimal and it is a time of war, so it's impossible to go and say they shouldn't serve at all. And we're going to say, well, Gantz, who was defense minister, who pushed the law, wanted this, so we're pushing it again. Now, Gantz himself and everybody knows that the situation's changed October 7th. We need a lot more soldiers. And in a time of war where the same Knesset and government are trying to legislate or are legislating greater service for every other sector of the community, there's got to be a lot more annual reserves, etc., and people have to serve longer in the army. And then on the other hand, you're giving a whole community a blank card not to serve at all. That's obviously unfair. What we have seen, so basically what Netanyahu did is he passed this week, or the coalition passed, basically a law that would allow a law that passed or bill that passed its first reading then to move on from that point of view. So they wanted to really take Gantz's law specifically and bring it forward, because to get to the stage of the first reading can take a month or two. It is now at this point going into the committee, the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee of Yuli Edelstein. Yuli Edelstein has been very open and said that this law will not stand as is. We need far greater numbers. Our needs are different. He isn't going to go all the way over that someone like Lieberman or Lapid or many others would like, that all Israelis have to do some service, whether it's military or national service. But it's clear that what he and certain other Likud and even religious Zionists, Smotrich's party, and perhaps Ben Gvir's party, they all are saying that everything's changed since October 7th, and they may have not been 100% comfortable with ultra-Orthodox not going to the army before, but certainly there is a greater need now. And probably what they come up with will be more than the ultra-Orthodox can accept, which means that we're again at this point where there'll be disagreements and nothing will move forward, disappointing both sides, which could well lead to one of the parties, maybe one of the ultra-Orthodox, saying, well, we're not getting anything in this government, so perhaps it's time for us to leave. The big question is, when could that be? We have around 5 or 6 weeks left of the summer session, and it's very important because once we get into the summer, that's already a couple of months, and then we get into the Jewish holidays, and by the time the Jewish holidays are over, we're already pretty much in November. And even if there was a party to leave then and we had a law to disperse the government, elections would then not be held until at the earliest February 2025. So all Netanyahu has to do is really hold together his coalition, which I believe he will, for the next 5 to 6 weeks. There's only really 15 legislative days, because obviously not every day you can legislate. It's usually Monday and Wednesdays. So if the ultra-Orthodox demand a particular law, he could probably find a way to put it off. But it does seem, the fact that Shas didn't make any demands to leave the government, that they understand what's going on as well. So I don't think, as I said, elections are happening immediately. It could be something will happen in the next few weeks that could change that. But I think at this point, there are major disagreements. There is a major gap in trust between all of the parties currently in the government, but they all, I think, would prefer the government to remain in place for the moment. We've also got another deadline or moment or event which could also play into this, and that's obviously when Prime Minister Netanyahu goes next month to address both houses of Congress, and he will want certainly as quiet, as much quiet as possible from the home base in the lead up and afterwards, because he obviously wants to get as much attention as possible. Moving over to US-Israel relations, there's been a relatively major spat in recent days between Netanyahu and the Biden administration over arms delivery. We've seen this over the last few months, but there is supposed to be a major arms delivery, and again, it seems to have been held up. Now, there's a couple of differences of opinion amongst the decision makers, whether that's the correct path or not. Netanyahu and Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, who acts almost as a as a senior advisor to Netanyahu, both believe that at this point it's important to make a lot of noise, perhaps to ensure that Congress deals with this, that the American people are aware of this, that even the Israeli people. There are others like Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, who believe that this needs to be worked out behind closed doors, that it can be sold and it will be sold. I believe Gallant is going to the US soon, and there's a lot of suggestions that that is when it will be sold. But there are growing gaps in the government at the senior levels. And don't forget, Gallant was the other, was now, because there's no war cabinet, was the other member of the war cabinet. So a very senior disagreement there. As far as the war goes in the south, the Rafah operation is pretty much ending in the next few weeks. There isn't the major full-scale battles that we've seen in other cities. There's more skirmishes. Hamas have pretty much moved over to guerrilla tactics. They come out and shoot when they can and then go back in. They're not coming as units, as fighting units in full frontal battles with the IDF. And speaking to a few people have come back from Rafah in the last few days, they said there are days where nothing really happens. So it's clear that particular stage of the operations of the war are coming to an end, which will have significant ramifications, or could have significant ramifications, in the north. And what we saw today, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah gave a very, very bellicose speech as a result of one of his senior lieutenants that were taken out by Israel in the preceding days. He certainly went further than he has in previous speeches, where he said we still have plans to invade the Galilee, which is the north of Israel, and threatened all sorts of things that they can reach, and they will target every single inch of Israel. Interestingly, in the speech, for the first time, Nasrallah threatened another country. He threatened Cyprus. He said if Cyprus gives any assistance to Israel as a landing base, as a rearming, or whatever it is, or whether it, others are using it to ship arms to Israel, then Cyprus could also see itself under attack. What makes this remarkable, let's not forget, is that Cyprus is an EU member. And here we have an acknowledged terrorist group threatening a member of the EU. So we'll have to wait and see whether the EU will react to that or not. At the moment, Amos Hochstein, who is the US mediator, was in the region. He met with Israelis, and now he's in Lebanon. And he's really got quite a job ahead of him, because he has to try and find some agreement to pull both parties back from a full-scale war, which seems, I wouldn't say absolutely inevitable, but almost inevitable. Quite simply, he probably can't go further than UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was passed after the Second Lebanon War in 2006, I think it was, or 2007, which basically, amongst other things, calls for Hezbollah to move back beyond the Litani River. The recent proposals, including by the French, have got are far less than that. They've called for a 10 kilometers buffer zone, which is much shorter than the Litani River. So obviously, Israel is thinking, well, if they ignored a UN resolution, why would they suddenly, Hezbollah ignored it from the first day it was passed, why would they agree to this? And certainly Hezbollah didn't necessarily agree. This was just a proposal by the French. So it's unlikely that he's going to get agreement from both Hezbollah and Israel. And it does seem that things are heating up. It does seem the threats are getting louder. It does seem that the attacks are getting more frequent. What certainly worried a lot of Israelis this week was images. Hezbollah released a 10-minute video from a drone, which they sent towards Haifa, where it basically took pictures of commercial sites, military sites, and residential buildings. And what most surprised Israelis, that it was able to do so, and Israel didn't see it, didn't shoot it down, and it was able to transfer all this information back to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah released it as a show for themselves and to Israelis that we can get partial defenses. We know exactly what you have and what you're doing, and we can pinpoint everything. So that caused a lot of consternation and horror within Israel. And it really, clearly it's the stage where where Hezbollah are not just saber rattling, they're really getting everything ready because they think Israel could launch an attack. We'll have to wait and see exactly how that plays out. And as I said, if things quieten down on the Gaza border, perhaps Hezbollah will see this as a face-saving way to end any threats. Because they've always said that they'll only do it. They're only attacking to try and divert attention from the Israeli attack against Hamas. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how that shapes up in the days and weeks ahead. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashley. I'll start with the what you kind of touched on earlier in your presentation. After Netanyahu released that video, the White House rejected his claim that the U.S. is withholding weapons, and it's being reported, I think, in the last day or so, that the White House has canceled that high-level meeting with Israeli officials.
Yeah.
If that is the case, what implications will that have for the Gaza war and the prospective Hezbollah war?
Well, the meeting itself will be rescheduled. It's more of just a sort of sign of discontent from the Biden administration. These things happen, and these things have even happened during the war. There was during the early weeks, I think it was, Derma and National Security Advisor Hanegbi was supposed to travel to America, but there was some disagreement. I can't remember exactly what it was, and the meeting was cancelled, but it was eventually rescheduled only a few weeks later. It is hoped that this will work its way out. As I said, Yoav Gallant is traveling to the US in the coming days, I think it is. And it was hoped that that would be worked out then. But there is anger in the Biden administration because not necessarily the issue itself, but because Netanyahu decided to go so public with it. As you said, I didn't mention that in my remarks, but you're right. Prime Minister Netanyahu recorded an English language message very clearly targeted at the Biden administration and the American people. And that really upset a lot of senior Biden administration officials. And I think the cancellation of that strategic meeting, again, I don't think it will be a long-term thing. I think it's a show of discontent. But I think, these meetings at various levels are happening all the time, and I don't think it will have a major, long-lasting effect on what's going on in the south or the north.
All right, now I'm going to go to a question from Stephen Miller, who asks, we were previously told that the hostages were in Rafah. Now we've recently been told that the IDF controls 60 to 70% of Rafah. So where do you think those remaining 116 hostages are?
Without giving up, I mean, it's not that I'm privy to the most secretive information, but what is out in the public arena and what I'm hearing, is that Israel and most people understand there's probably no more than 30 or certainly less than 40 live hostages. Hamas themselves said that they don't even know how many. I heard from someone today that Israel knows where 90% of them are, but they're in places they can't get to so easily, underground. It's very hard to just open up these tunnels because they're booby-trapped. And then if you attack them, how do you know you're not attacking the hostages? And even if you're not attacking the hostages may be killed, as happened in one failed rescue attempt where they tried to rescue a hostage. And during the rescue operation, Hamas killed the hostage before he could be taken alive back to Israel. So there is a lot of nervousness about that, obviously. They don't know. I say that they know where 90% of them are. I don't know exactly where it is. I'm assuming some are in Rafah. Maybe some others will be moved to Khan Yunis. Don't forget, these tunnels are sometimes tens of kilometers. So they could be moved around frequently. I'm sure after the successful rescue last week, they're taking even more precautions. So it's one thing to know where the hostages are, or at least have a good idea of where they are. It's another thing to be able to rescue them. As I said, all the senior Hamas officials and probably the last fighters of Hamas are underground. They're not coming out to fight. It's not where the war was even a month ago. So it's not as easily done. I think at the moment they're trying to conquer as much overground as possible, and then try and go meticulously, tunnel by tunnel to see what possibilities are. But one of the reasons I heard that they're being so careful at this point is because they don't want to endanger the hostages. So that would lead me to believe that there is intelligence that at least some are in Rafah, probably almost certainly underground at this point. So again, that's probably all I can say at this point.
Now we have a question from Carrie Hillebrand. And what discussion is complete without talk of the Jewish space lasers? She asks, how soon is Israel expected to begin deployment of the Iron Beam laser defense system?
Good question. I'm not 100% sure. I know it's in the final stages of development and it's been successfully tested. When I say successful, not in actual war, but it's been tested all the time. But it's not yet ready. I don't think it will be ready during this war. I think we're talking about over a year till maybe it could be deployed in some sort of active conflict situation. But certainly at this point in time, Israel is still, asking for Iron Dome batteries, which shows that we're still very reliant on that system at the moment.
Now, in recent days and weeks, there's been a whole lot of videos circulating of the American pier, the floating pier in Gaza, and it shows that it is quite literally sinking and crumbling into the sea, as many people predicted that it would. Do you think that it'll eventually, inevitably be dismantled? And if so, do you see a time frame for that?
Well, it seems to be in need of repairs more than it's actually been in use, and the amount of aid that was brought in through the pier, considering the cost, resources, and time it took, is relatively minimal. But it is a big project for the Americans, and they'll try and keep it going for as long as possible because of the cost, because of the big fanfare. But it's every time there seems to be, they say, in anticipation of a major storm. We haven't really had major storms. Maybe on the coast there are more storms, but or maybe it just needs a relatively limited storm to create enough waves to make it inoperable. But the fact is, it keeps on being towed to Ashkelon for repairs. Interestingly, there is a narrative in Gaza that the pier was used as part of the rescue attempt. And in fact, that was even parroted on Al Jazeera. In fact, even apparently in The Independent, a British newspaper in Arabic, even put a cartoon showing that the pier was part of Israel's rescue. Clearly it wasn't. The Americans certainly would not allow it to, and Israel certainly wouldn't ask the Americans to use it. And simply, Israel didn't need it. If it can't bring in aid, it certainly can't aid Israel in its military operations. But that is a narrative that's going around, so that the Gazan people have a relatively negative attitude towards it. It has been, as you said, largely a failure up until this point. But maybe they'll do something to buttress it, and maybe they'll be more successful in the future. I have no more information about that to offer. Sorry, at this point.
Sure, no problem. And thank you. Finally, I wanted to touch on the events going on in the north of Israel towards Lebanon. As you noted, the Israelis, or excuse me, Hassan Nasrallah has threatened the Cypriots if they should help the Israelis. In the event that happens and Hezbollah takes action against Cyprus, can you maybe comment or speculate on what the Turkish response will be?
That's an interesting question. My sense is I don't think Hezbollah would dare to attack Cyprus. Again, it's an EU country. I think that would be beyond the pale. It can and has threatened, but also, the role that Cyprus plays is some people in Israel scratching their heads. Lebanon is just across the border from Israel. Why would Israel need, refueling or whatever it is from Cyprus? As far as armaments from America, to the best of my knowledge, they come straight to Israel. So I'm not quite sure. We do have a good strategic relationship with Cyprus. Perhaps it is part of this sort of, Cyprus and Israel and Greece have sidelined to a certain extent Turkey and some others, Lebanon probably one of those, on bringing in gas and other things towards Europe through Israel. So perhaps it's part of this gambit at the moment. But it's unclear exactly why he would threaten Cyprus. But I cannot imagine Hezbollah would dare, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't believe it would dare to actually attack an EU country. And it will be a very interesting to see what the EU's response, if Nasrallah should ever take such an action.
All right. Well, thank you. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast. Thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. And for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout for our weekly podcast offerings email coming out over the weekend. We thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.